Shalom Aleichem. I'd like to share with you a message for Shavuot emanating from Yitro, even though there is significant disagreement in the Gemara whether or not Yitro is actually present at the giving of the Torah. Nevertheless, he's going to teach us an important lesson. Yitro merits to have the parsha in which we learn of Gilui Shekhinah, divine revelation, to be named after him. What was it about Yitro that qualified him for this honor? There are 4 episodes in the Torah containing references to Yitro, either by the name Yitro or by one of the other 6 names by which he was known. 2 references are longer in quantity and contain significant conversation between Yitro and Moshe. The first of these 2 is Yitro's reunion with Moshe, where Yitro comes together with his daughter Tzipora, Moshe's wife, and Moshe's 2 sons. They join Moshe and Bnei Yisrael at the encampment by the Har Sinai, Mount Sinai. There is conversation upon arrival in which Moshe is conveying information to Yitro. And the next morning, there's conversation in which Yitro is conveying advice to Moshe how to be a more effective leader. At the end of Moshe's implementation of Yisro's advice, albeit with a slight modification, small but very important modification, at the end of that episode, the Torah tells us, "Vayishalach Moshe et chotno, vayelech lo el artzo," that Moshe sent off his father-in-law, and he, meaning Yitro, went to his land. The final episode with Yitro is found in Sefer Bamidbar, in Parshas Bahaloscha. Moshe approaches Yitro asking that he accompany the nation on our route to the land of Israel. This is before the sin of the spies, Chet HaMeraglim. It was time for us to march forward and to enter the land promised to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and to be fulfilled at this point under the leadership of Moshe. Moshe turns to his father-in-law and asks him, "Please join us. And whatever goodness we're blessed with, we will share with you as well." Yitro says, "Lo elech," I'm not going to go. "Ki im el artzi ve'el moladati elech." Rather, I'm going back to my land. I'm going back to my birthplace, my family. Moshe's not willing to take no for an answer. He says, "Al na ta'azov otanu." Please don't leave us. My dear father-in-law, you have a lot of information. You've helped us to date. You know the desert. You know certain things about the routes. You could serve a very valuable role for us. Please join us, and we'll be good to you. We're not told, but Yisro answers. The very next verse tells us, "Vayis'u mehar Hashem," that we started our travels. There are at least 2 major differences of opinion about this final episode. Number 1, did Yitro concede to Moshe, or did he hold his ground and return to Midian? The Ramban, perhaps also employing the principle of shtika kehoda'ah, that silence is like acquiescence, the Ramban holds that Yitro agreed and accompanied Moshe and Bnei Israel on the way to Israel. Rashi holds Yisro went home. The Ramban holds that these two major episodes which we discussed, Yisro's reunion with Moshe at Har Sinai, and the discussion about whether or not Yisro will join Bnei Israel on our journey into Israel, the Ramban holds that these are two separate episodes, that there are two separate visits. That the first visit, Yisro came to Har Sinai, and at the end of that visit, by Yishalach, Moshe sent his father-in-law home, agreed to let his father-in-law go home. And then, according to the Ramban, Yisro came back and would have continued the journey with Bnei Yisrael. Rashi holds this is one episode. What happened in Parshas Yisro around the time of the giving of the Torah, and what happened in Bahaloscha, in Sefer Bamidbar, that this is all one story. So it's very strange. It's one story, but the Torah tells us the end of the story near the beginning of the story. That Moshe agrees to let Yisro go home, to Rashi is the end of the story. He doesn't agree with the Ramban. And yet the end of the story is told somewhere between the beginning and the middle of the story. Why is it? What's the logic here? I had the schus to study with Nechama Leibowitz, a giant Torah scholar and a master pedagogue. I presented the question to Nechama Leibowitz and suggested an answer which she endorsed. And the answer is Yisro's message to us for Shavuot. Why does Yisro come to reunite with Moshe and Bnei Yisrael? Yisro was motivated by the reports he heard regarding the Exodus and other wonders of God. But from his personal reunion and conversation with Moshe, he learns more. He develops a deeper appreciation of God's power and the beauty of Hashem's word. By Yichad Yitro, he acts with joy over his newly discovered insights and knowledge of Hashem. Yisro acknowledges Hashem, Hashem's powers, and Hashem's uniqueness. So why, according to Rashi, who holds Yisro made only one visit, why tell us of his departure when he's still at the beginning of his visit? The reality is that often we get excited about an endeavor. It might be an act of chesed, it might be a commitment of studying Torah, but we let that enthusiasm fizzle away. Because Yisro's desire to return to his family stemmed from his excitement, the Torah mentions the end of the story up front. The Torah reveals to us that Yisro left Bnei Yisrael's encampment not because he was tired of his new surrounding, not because he was homesick, not because he became bored. Rather, the Torah captures Yisro's excitement and desire to invite others in the recognition and acceptance of God's greatness. Yitro made his decision at the beginning of his visit that he had to leave and share. And it's this excitement that Yitro carried with him that we try to recapture each year on Shavuot as we celebrate Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. May we all succeed in recapturing and carrying forward that excitement in Limud HaTorah. A Chag Sameach to all.